mentioned Air America. Yeah, that's true. They got paid, but not very much, let me tell you. And then they worked under my shop for a long period of time, and they picked up more pilots than our Jolly Greens did over time in Laos. They were truly heroic, not properly recognized for this.
This T-28 is called, the name of it's called a Trojan. And the Trojan was a very versatile trainer. And because it had so much ability to carry armament, it made a great transition plane to go from trainer into fighter. It's a very strong airplane. It's rugged, very well built, and it's got a lot of history to it.
You cannot place statues or build memorials in thin air. These airplanes, rescued, restored, returned to the sky, are the memorials. Through them, we give enduring thanks to those who gave everything they had to defend everything that we hold dear. By sharing them, we remind each other of the sacrifice. By sharing them, we introduce our heirs to their heritage. One week each summer, these national treasures are flown here. Twice each day, those who restored them present them to those who risked their lives to fight in them. And those who really did it tell the rest of us how it really was. It is a singular series of history lessons that anyone who cherishes liberty ought to see. It's called the world's greatest aviation celebration. For 1 week every summer during the annual fly-in convention of the Experimental Aircraft Association, Whitman Regional Airport in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, executes more flight operations than any other airport on Earth. So much happens here, it is physically impossible for one person to see it all. It's much more than an airplane rally. For example, history lives here this week. Here, the latest generation doesn't hear about the greatest generation. It hears from them in forums that are held twice daily called Warbirds in Review.
The idea for Warbirds in Review started several years ago. On our many trips to Oshkosh, we find that people are very interested in the airplanes. When you're pre-flighting an airplane or when you're working on it, the crowd would gather. And so we said, why don't we do a formal time frame to just allow people to come visit with the pilot. But initially, it was to have the aircraft owner in front of their airplane and set a time when people could come and know that they would be able to hear about the airplane. From that, it evolved into, well, if we're going to have the P-51 here and someone talk about it, and you have the old Crow airplane, wouldn't it be wonderful if people could hear Bud Anderson's story? Wouldn't it be wonderful if people could hear from Jack Roush how he restored the airplane? So from that idea, it has grown and to a point that maybe it's a little too hard to handle, but the rewards are great.
The best way to describe these forums may be to call them reunions that consist of several layers. They begin with a reunion of the spectators with the era in which the airplane and the veterans served. Often the forums include heartwarming reunions of people who served together in harm's way. And they always include moving reunions of veterans with the aircraft they flew in our defense. Sam Bass has been helping host and moderate Warbirds in Review presentations since they began 12 years ago. He's an Air Force veteran, retired Delta Airlines captain, and a high-time volunteer warbird pilot, having flown EAA's B-17 aluminum overcast on its goodwill tours for 20 years. All veterans are recognized at every forum.
We're going to be emphasizing the Vietnam War this week. And before I get started, could I have all the veterans stand up, please?
It would not be an exaggeration to say that news, if not history, was made at this particular Warbirds in Review forum. In this forum, spectators would be introduced to one of the most overlooked and underappreciated airplanes in the history of the U.S. Air Forces, the iconic North American T-28 Trojan, and the part it played in the secret war in Laos, the complicated and clandestine Southeast Asian conflict that began in the 1950s and ran until the U.S. departure in 1973. But it's the presenters who make the Warbirds in Review forums invaluable. Here, this week on this Wisconsin airfield, spectators will get these amazing stories firsthand from those who actually flew and fought. from those who were not just eyewitnesses to history, they were making history. The T-28 piston airplane was initially developed to replace the T-6, which had been training pilots since World War II. But it became so much more, as owner-pilot Ken Fardie explained to the audience.
This T-28 is called, the name of it's called a Trojan. And this is a C model, which was used for the carrier qualifications. And as you can see, this one is pretty well decked out for combat, but the T-28 had a much different role in the very beginning. It was a trainer. 1947, they needed a advanced trainer to take the place of their retiring T-6s that were teaching pilots to fly in World War II. And they needed something that would simulate the fighter jets that were coming online at that time. The cockpit in the T-28 is very similar, almost identical to the F-86. So it gave them a better understanding of what they were getting into before they actually went into a jet, the early jets. The Trojan was a very versatile trainer, and because it had so much ability to carry armament, it made a great transition plane to go from trainer into fighter. They always had the ability to carry machine guns, rockets, bombs. They even carried external fuel tanks. And eventually, when things started breaking out in Southeast Asia, they realized that they had a great platform, and they took the trainers and they took them back to North American, and they designed what they called the D model for Delta. And what they did was they beefed them up. They gave them extra hard points in the wings. They carried about 3,000 pounds of ordnance, and eventually they actually put ejection seats in them. They had what they call a Stanley Yankee ejection seat. And this plane here is painted in the Southeast Asia camo colors that represents the 1st Air Division, 2nd Fighter Squadron, which is the tiger on the tail, for the South Vietnamese Air Force. It's a very strong airplane. It's rugged, very well built, and it's got a lot of history to it.
Eventually, there were nearly 2,000 T-28s built. Perhaps the main reason they remained such a well-kept aviation secret is because so much of their work was done in secret, such as being the workhorse of the Air Force and CIA in the secret war in Laos, which was fought by men including Dick Welch and General Secord. As an Air Force officer and pilot, and as an officer on loan to the CIA, Major General Richard Secord compiled a notable career working in covert operations, including the secret war in Laos. Our next guest is Dick Secord. He graduated from West Point in 1955, earned his Silver Wings in 56, had a distinguished 28 years as an Air Force officer, has a master's degree in international affairs from GW, finished the programs Air Command and Staff and the Naval War College at Newport. He spent a number of years as an instructor, but then in the early 60s became part of that first Air Commando Wing, flying AT-28s, hundreds of missions in Southeast Asia. And then in the mid-60s, he was transferred to Udorn in Thailand, and that's what we're going to hear about. This is General Dick Secord.
Thank you, David. I started, as he said, flying the AT-28. The Defense Department redesignated this particular genre of 28s, the AT-28, in the early 60s. And it had a number of models, as you've been told, carry about 3,500 pounds of ordnance. I never met a pilot who didn't like this airplane. It was agile. It was strong, took battle damage greatly, and so on. I could go on about it all day.
In a separate interview, General Secord talked about how an Army cadet graduate of West Point ends up in the United States Air Force.
With respect to going in the Air Force from West Point for many years before the Air Force Academy started operations, by agreement right after World War II, when they were forming a separate Air Force, the so-called Key West agreements took place, and it stipulated that about 30% of the graduates of West Point and 25% of the graduates of Annapolis would go into the Air Force.
The U.S. Air Force was established in the immediate aftermath of World War II. At a meeting of the service chiefs in Key West, Florida in 1948, an agreement drafted by James V. Forrestal, the first United States Secretary of Defense, outlined the division of air assets between the Army, Navy, and the newly created Air Force.
My first tour of duty in South Vietnam was started in 1962, flying T-28, AT-28Bs at the time. And we were not allowed to log our missions during most of that tour because we weren't there. I guess
what percentage of your missions that you flew were classified?
All of them. The cover was that we were there on training missions. I can honestly say, while I was in Vietnam at least, never flew any training missions.
Would you explain the politics of why we had to go into Laos, which was a neutral country according to Geneva Accords? So what forced us to go in there?
The Geneva Accords, signed in 1962, neutralized, theoretically, that area. Unfortunately, the enemy did not withdraw at all and, in fact, increased their presence. And although they denied it always, to the end, I think they still denied it. And we weren't there either, and we denied it. So we're both not there.
The Geneva Accords of 1962 were the result of an attempt to return Laos, a nation President Dwight David Eisenhower considered the cornerstone of Southeast Asia, to neutrality. Going back to 1945, when the communist Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence from France, the U.S. and the West held to the theory that a communist victory in one nation in Southeast Asia would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states. As it became increasingly apparent that the French were failing in their attempt to retake control of the area called Indochina, which the Japanese had occupied during World War II, President Eisenhower attempted to rally congressional and public support for the French by explaining the importance of that area to United States national interests. In a press conference held in April of 1954, Eisenhower coined one of the most famous of all Cold War phrases when he introduced the domino theory. I recall that it was President Eisenhower who talked about the domino theory, and as I recall said that Laos was the first domino to fall, and for that reason we had to block the North Vietnamese from Laos. How successful were we?
Well, I think that was the impetus for the 62 Accords, which were signed during the Kennedy administration. And the so-called domino theory was quite prevalent in those times. whether or not it bore fruit or not is still a subject of debate among scholars. But the scholars weren't fighting the war, and we were. And I think we did it effectively. Had we had more reasonable rules throughout, we would have prevailed absolutely. The evidence of that is the 12 days of Christmas in 1972, when our Air Force just pulverized, our Air Force and Army, Navy aviation pulverized North Vietnam. In 12 days, they had them on their knees. Had we done that 10 years earlier, or 8 years, or 5 years earlier, I think it would have been a different outcome.
Eisenhower said that you have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is that it will go over very quickly. This would lead to disintegration in Southeast Asia with the loss of Burma, of Thailand, of the peninsula, and Indonesia following.
The 1962, while I was in Vietnam the first time, they concluded the 1962 pact, which the U.S. was a signatory to, called the Geneva Accord. Among other things, this series of accords supposedly neutralized Laos. It required the withdrawal of all foreign forces, including specifically North Vietnamese Army and U.S. Army. The U.S. Army had a contingent in Laos as trainers called White Star. Before that time, they had to withdraw them, and we did. The North Vietnamese did not. In fact, they increased their presence and started building what we came to call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, all during this time frame. I went back to South Vietnam briefly in 1966, and then I was on detail with CIA for 3 years as an air officer. They used to call us Christmas help. They needed some airmen, and it seemed like an exciting thing to do, so I was able to volunteer for that. No, you're just on loan to the agency. You retain your status as a commissioned officer if you're an officer. The difference is you're in an organization which is legally authorized to do certain operations under Title 50 of the U.S. Code. The military is funded under Title and controlled under Title 10. So you're moving into a more unconventional area. But again, I say you're just on loan. They spent a good deal of time on Geneva Convention strictures with us, but often we didn't wear rank. We wore pretty much what we wanted, especially in the first 3 or 4 months. We were not allowed to log the missions. That continued until about halfway through my tour there. The agency needed some people in their air branch because who were current, experienced tactical pilots, because that's not the way they're structured. They don't have too many fighter pilots on their active ones on their rolls. But they ended up being effectively in charge of the war in Laos. The CIA fell heir to that war by default, you might say, because we had to withdraw military forces. We had to react to what was going on, and that was the CIA. And they had many thousands of indigenous so-called troops that they were supporting and trying to train and so forth. And there are 5 military regions in Laos. Just in in MR2 alone, where the famous Hmong mountain tribesmen were located. When I first got there, they had 80,000 of them on the rolls. They managed to attrit quite a few of those, but that was, a pretty sizable force. In Laos, there were really two different kinds of war. The war on the Panhandle, which was crucial to our interests, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was. Their only supply line really into South Vietnam after they stopped the infiltrations by sea, which was fairly easy. But the truck traffic just grew and grew and grew. And it wasn't just one road, it was a bunch of motorable dirt trails down through jungle and the karst that fanned out all the way along the border. Interdicting that line of communications was crucial, but we never seemed to get that. Mainly, I guess, because the strict reading of the Geneva Accords of '62 prohibited that. But and once again, we played by the rules. The enemy did not.
One of the most heroic groups under the command of General Secord and the CIA in Laos were the Forward Air Controllers, or FACs, nicknamed the Ravens. Writer Christopher Robbins described this covert corps of pilots like this, quote, "The FAC was essential to every aspect of the military operation. It was his job to find the target, order up fighter bombers, mark the target accurately with white phosphorus smoke rockets, and control the operation throughout the time the planes remained on station. The FAC then stayed over the target to make a bomb damage assessment. Putting on a strike meant that you were busier than a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest," the pilot said, unquote. Where else are you likely to meet a legendary Raven firsthand than during a Warbirds in Review?
This is Dick Welch here, and he was a Raven. And there's a little forward in the book that I'm going to read from you here that'll really kind of set the stage of this. The book was about the war in Southeast Asia from 1961 to 73. It says, quote, "While America and the rest of the world watched on television a handful of elite Air Force pilots wearing anything but uniforms and piloting unarmored, small, prop-driven aircraft fought a secret war, one that remains secret up to this day. The few pilots who knew about it called it the Other Theater, a small nation called Laos next to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, China and Thailand. These incredibly brave and skilled pilots were known as the Ravens. Fly low, slow, spot the enemy, and direct winged artillery of American airstrikes from South Vietnam, Thailand, and aircraft carriers." Now that's what they did. That was their mission. And this is one of them. And this is Dick Welch. He has a DFC with 1 Oak Leaf Feather, 13 Air Medals, numerous Laos awards, which he cannot interpret what they are, so he just knows he has them. He flew Covey FAC, and we'll talk about that in a minute, let you explain what that was, in OV-10s prior to the Ravens. So if you can tell them what Covey FAC is.
The Covey FAC was a call sign. Anybody who was in Southeast Asia during that time, it was interesting when you came back and you met somebody, you'd say, "What was your call sign?" Well, the call sign stayed the same when you left. Somebody, the next people in, they used the same call sign for the same equipment at the same base. So a Covey FAC with a first letter of 5 flew into Laos on all his missions. So all my missions, even though half my time was based in Vietnam, all my missions were in Laos.
Just give us a typical mission.
Typical mission would be.
And what time you left, and
typical mission was daylight only. We didn't fly dark. So we take off early in the morning, And more often than not, we'd have the coordinates of some place that the CIA, the road team people had identified. There's a building out there full of munitions. And we go out there, and you'd fly over it, and it's double canopy, you can't see anything. You could put some ordnance on it, but you probably wouldn't get it, and if you did, they'd just move it, or the next day they'd have guns there. So we would fly over the targets that they had identified. The intelligence is really good. And if we saw an target and opportunity that something was moving, well, we just go to that. But the one I'm thinking about is it was a building as big as one of these hangars. It was in double canopy, and each of the four guys at POC looked at it for 2 or 3 days in a row and found the agency guys come by, hey, don't you pay attention to us, you know? And he said, well, we pay attention, but if we hang out, they'll put up some guns and shoot us down. So we all took turns going over at different times of the day, and once we were out there, we would stop at these dirt strips and refuel. So you'd leave POC in the morning. It was a place much like this, a paved road and runway and all. If you came to one late in the afternoon and the CIA guys weren't there, we didn't know if it was in our control. You couldn't land. But anyway, we did get a big building. Finally, the sun was just right, and you could see the ridge building. And we put T-28 napalm on it, and it burned for all day and went up about 3,000 feet. It was mixed munitions for sure, because you could see different kinds of colored smoke and different tracers coming out of it, and it really set them back.
Did you feel like when you finished your tour of duty that you had been effective? That what you guys were doing was
in my
effective?
zip code, yeah, we kept them back on their heels and where I was. This was after we went into Cambodia in May of '70, and the reaction to that was they moved the Ho Chi Minh Trail closer to the people, the Royal Lao and Pak Se that we were supporting. So it became more intense for them, and to keep them back at their old property line, which is about halfway across Laos. Yeah, we sent them back.
The secret war in Laos also gave notoriety to another, mostly misunderstood, CIA aerial operation, commonly known as Air America. Unfortunately, much of the public came to know about this unit through that most unreliable of all historical sources, the Hollywood movie. The movie portrayed a shadowy, CIA enterprise involved in activities from delivering the illegal drugs of corrupt Laotian military leaders to black market weapons dealing. The film was a gross disservice to those who risked all in the service of our country and the cause of freedom in Southeast Asia, according to those who were there.
He mentioned Air America. Yeah, that's true. They got paid, but not very much, let me tell you. And they worked under my shop for a long period of time, and they picked up more pilots than our Jolly Greens did over time in Laos. They were truly heroic, not properly recognized for this.
Air America was, in fact, a passenger and cargo airline owned by the U.S. government. Its operating ethos was, quote, anything, anywhere, anytime, professionally, unquote. Its aircraft included the Curtiss C-46 Commando, the Pilatus PC-6 Porter, the de Havilland Canada DH-04, the C-130, and the Fairchild C-123 Provider. Along with the UH-34D, the Bell 204B, 205, and CH-47C helicopters, Air America flew many types of cargo to countries including the Republic of Vietnam, the kingdoms of Laos and Cambodia, and even top-secret missions into Burma and the People's Republic of China.
Well, with respect to Air America, that's a story all its own, and the U.S. government has not recognized them adequately, in my opinion. All these irregular forces over the years, with airlift and resupply, all these teams I mentioned that are along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, They were resupplied by night airdrops with Caribous, the noisemaker, for example. Those are Air America airplanes. Their C-123s did Trojan work. As I mentioned, their helicopter pilots were famous. Most of them were former military people. The myth was that they were very highly paid mercenaries. But I thought they were very lowly paid mercenaries, if you want to call them that, but they weren't paid a lot of money. I know because I ran them for 3 years. And so, effectively, if they didn't run me, they were legendary in my view. So the movie Air America, as I said earlier, was a guy with a hogwash, and smuggling drugs and all that. You can never use them as drug smugglers. We had more than 100 CIA officers overseeing them. You know, how long do you think they're going to get away with smuggling drugs under those circumstances? AT-28 served in combat in all three of the Indochina countries for a long, long time. Everybody knows in reveres the Mustangs and the Thunderbolts and the P-38s and so forth. Almost nobody knows about the AT-28s, which actually served in combat longer than any of those birds did. So just kind of a pet peeve of mine. The pilots who flew these airplanes were exceptionally bold, and the casualty rates were significant, no doubt, but the damage that they wrought was just disproportionate to their numbers. We only had about 100 of these airplanes at any given time.
How could we have prosecuted it more effectively?
Interdicted the Ho Chi Minh Trail with troops rather than trying to do it with forward air controllers and tactical air, and struck north as we did in Linebacker 2 at the same time. It would have been over in a fortnight. Those two actions simultaneously would have put them back decades. I mean, they would have tossed the towel in faster than you could say your name, in my opinion. The United States lost that war. I've heard a lot of people try to argue that no, we didn't really, in the bigger picture. What developed thereafter, rapprochement with China and so forth, proved that we really won the big war. That's just hogwash. We lost the war, but we lost it politically. There's no question about that. But the war really had been going on, the shooting war had been going on for, 13 years that I've described so far. The American body politic is famous for having a fairly short span of support when it comes to warfare, especially with American troops. And there were a lot of casualties in that war. More than 58,000 men killed in that war. No small thing. And the one thing that our foes, potential enemies, understand is power. They understand that. They understand it very well. They understand it in the Middle East. They understand it throughout that region. If you want to play the game of nations, you've got to have all the instruments necessary, not just diplomacy, not just intelligence, but you got to have the military. And you can have the best military around, which I think we probably do, ounce for ounce, dollar for dollar. I think we do. But if you don't have the political will, then you're whistling Dixie.
Years ago, Emerson wrote, "There is no history, there is only biography," unquote. The fact is, people make history. It's from the threads of the lives of countless individuals who were called to serve that the whole cloth of history is woven. Yes, we could find the history of the T-28 or the secret war in Laos in books or on the internet, but not the story. For that, we need to listen to those who flew the airplanes and fought that war. We need to see their eyes and hear their voices. We need to look at the cockpits they looked at before strapping in and flying off into the unknown. For that, we need a place, a garden, where history remains organic. For that, we need Warbirds in Review.